In the neon violet haze of the diner, the rule for the help was simple. Be a shadow, be silent, and never, under any circumstances, interrupt the man at the corner booth. Zuri knew the rule. She had survived years in the city's chaos by being invisible, her deep, warm brown skin acting as a natural cloak in the dim light. But tonight, the air felt heavy, charged with the static of a lightning strike. At the center of the storm sat Kang De-Shik. His tailored white shirt looked sharp against his tanned skin, and his dark eyes rarely showed emotion. As Zuri stepped forward, a sudden movement at the table caused a glass to tilt. A drop of red liquid splashed onto De-Shik's pristine white cuff. The diner went silent. The music seemed to die as his bodyguard, Ryu Sang-min, shifted his weight, hand moving toward his holster. Zuri didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her apron, pulled out a clean linen cloth, and reached for his wrist. "It will stain if you let it sit," she said, her voice a calm, melodic silk that cut through the silence. For the first time, the iron architect looked up, and his cold gaze met hers. The heavy scent of old grease and cheap floor cleaner usually acted as Zuri's anchor, a reminder of the reality she could control. But after the encounter with the iron architect, the air in the diner felt thin. Her hands, usually as steady as a surgeon's, trembled slightly as she wiped down the counter. It wasn't just the memory of Kang De-Shik's cold, intense gaze. It was the silence that followed him, a vacuum that seemed to have sucked the safety out of her world. When her shift finally ended at 2:00 a.m., Zuri walked toward the bus stop, her black flats clicking rhythmically against the rain-slicked pavement. She felt the weight of her deep brown skin acting as a cloak in the shadows, but tonight, the shadows felt occupied. The front door to her apartment was ajar. Panic, sharp and cold, pierced her chest. She pushed inside to find her younger brother, Malik, slumped at the kitchen table, his face a map of fresh bruises. On the table sat a manila envelope. "Malik, what happened?" she whispered, her voice a thread of silk ready to snap. "They came for the money, Zuri," he choked out, refusing to meet her large, expressive eyes. "The gambling, the interest, it's too much, we're done." Zuri's heart hammered against her ribs as she opened the envelope. Inside weren't just demands, there were photographs. Some were of Malik, but the rest were of her. Zuri at the bus stop, Zuri serving coffee, Zuri laughing with a coworker. The last photo, however, stopped her breath. It was a picture of the man who had threatened Malik, but his face was crossed out in red ink. Attached was a receipt for a bank transfer that cleared the entire debt, millions of ones signed with a single, elegant chop. Kang. A realization washed over her, colder than the midnight rain. De-Shik hadn't just been watching her from the corner booth for a week, he had been systematically dismantling the threats around her. The midnight tip hadn't been a gesture of kindness, it was a down payment. She looked at her reflection in the cracked hallway mirror, seeing the heart-shaped face and soft cheekbones that had somehow snared a monster. Her pride, the very thing she used to keep her head high, now felt like a noose. She had spent her life trying to be invisible, only to realize she was the singular obsession of the city's most dangerous man. He hadn't just cleared her brother's debt, he had bought the path she walked on. The grease and neon of the diner felt different now, less like a sanctuary and more like a glass cage. Zuri moved through her shift with a quiet, practiced elegance, but her large, expressive eyes scanned every shadow. She felt the weight of the bank transfer in her pocket, a heavy reminder that her freedom had been bought by a man who rarely spoke. The bell above the door chimed, but it wasn't the rhythmic, heavy tread of De-Shik. Instead, 3 men in tracksuits pushed inside, their energy jagged and loud. They didn't sit. They walked straight to the counter, kicking a bar stool aside. "Where's the kid, Zuri?" the leader sneered, his eyes wandering over her slim, athletic frame with a look that made her skin crawl. "Malik owes, and a fancy bank transfer doesn't erase the disrespect of going over our heads." Zuri stood her ground, her heart-shaped face pale but set in a mask of calm composure. "The debt is settled. You saw the chop. You know who cleared it." "We don't take orders from ghost stories," the man spat, reaching across the counter to grab her wrist. Before his fingers could touch her warm brown skin, the air in the diner turned frigid. The front door didn't chime. It simply groaned as it was pushed open by a force that silenced the room. Ryu Sang-min stepped in first, his muscular, intimidating frame blocking the light, his scarred eyebrow twitching as he surveyed the threat. Behind him was the Iron Architect. Kang De-Shik walked in with a dangerous calm, his white dress shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that looked like they were corded with steel. He didn't look at the thugs. He looked only at Zuri, his intense dark eyes searching her face for a flicker of fear. "I believe," De-Shik said, his voice a low, cold authority that required no volume, "that I made it clear she is no longer part of your world." The lead thug trembled, his bravado vanishing like smoke. "Mr. Kang, we didn't realize. We thought." "You thought wrong," De-Shik interrupted. He gestured slightly with his hand. In a blur of motion, Ryu moved, and the three men were forced toward the exit with a violence that was efficient and terrifyingly quiet. De-Shik stepped closer, invading Zuri's space until she could smell the expensive sandalwood and cold rain clinging to his suit. He reached out, not to grab her, but to tuck a stray lock of hair back into her low bun. His touch was electric against her temple. "The diner is no longer safe for you, Zuri," he murmured, his gaze dropping to her full lips. "You have a new role now. Pack what you value. My car is waiting." Zuri looked at the white collar of her uniform, then back at the man who had just ended her life as a waitress. Her pride flared, a stubborn fire in her chest. "And if I say no?" "Then you stay and die for a pride you cannot afford," he replied simply. "But I think you are smarter than that." The ride to the outskirts of the city was a blur of neon lights fading into the deep, oppressive black of the private hills. Zuri sat in the back of the obsidian-tinted sedan, her small apron folded neatly in her lap, a final, fraying tie to the woman who had woken up that morning as a simple waitress. Beside her, Kang De-Shik remained a statue of tailored charcoal and cold intent, his silence more demanding than any shout. When the car finally slowed, the Onyx Gates swung open like the jaws of a great beast. The estate was a masterclass in silk and steel. Sharp, modern glass structures rose against the rugged cliffs, illuminated by recessed floor lighting that turned the manicured gardens into a dreamscape of silver and shadow. As Zuri stepped out, her black flats felt punishingly thin against the expensive marble of the driveway. She looked up at the towering entryway, her heart-shaped face tilted back, feeling the crushing weight of De-Shik's world. "This is not a home," Zuri whispered, her voice a soft, intelligent observation that drifted through the cool night air. "It's a fortress." "It is whatever I require it to be," De-Shik replied, stepping into her space. He didn't touch her, but his presence was an invisible tether. "Tonight, it is your sanctuary. Tomorrow, it is your classroom." Inside, the contrast was even more jarring. The minimalist foyer was stripped of warmth, filled instead with priceless art and the echoing footsteps of silent men in suits. Ryu Sang-min stood by the door, his scarred brow twitching as he watched Zuri with a clinical, wary eye. To the syndicate, she was a liability. To De-Shik, she was the only piece of the puzzle that didn't fit his perfect, cold design. De-Shik led her to a suite that overlooked the distant, glittering city, the world she used to belong to. On the bed lay a silk robe, its deep violet hue matching the bruises on Malik's face. "You are safe here, Zuri," De-Shik said, his intense dark eyes finally softening, if only by a fraction. "But safety has a price. You will no longer hide in the shadows of a diner. You will learn to walk in mine." Zuri turned toward the floor-to-ceiling window, her reflection ghosting over the lights of the slums she had fought so hard to leave. Her pride hummed in her chest, a stubborn reminder that she wasn't a pet to be kept. She looked at De-Shik, her expressive eyes narrowing. "I was a waitress, Mr. Kang. I know how to serve," she said, her voice regaining its melodic silk. "But don't mistake my composure for submission. You bought my debt, not my soul." A ghost of a smirk touched De-Shik's sharp jawline. "I didn't buy you to submit, Zuri. I bought you because you were the only one who didn't." The silence of the estate was not the empty quiet of the diner at 3:00 a.m. It was a pressurized, expectant stillness. Zuri spent her first morning in the wing De-Shik had assigned her, her heart-shaped face reflected in gold-rimmed mirrors that felt like mockery. She had traded her black waitress dress for a silk slip, but her posture remained as rigid as if she were still carrying a loaded tray. The lessons began without a word. De-Shik appeared in the doorway of the library, his white shirt sleeves rolled up, revealing the powerful frame of a man who built empires with his bare hands. He didn't offer a book, he offered a challenge. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to a velvet chair opposite his desk. Zuri sat, her deep brown skin glowing against the dark fabric. For an hour, he did nothing but work, his intense dark eyes moving across digital ledgers while Zuri was forced to endure the weight of his proximity. It was a psychological war, an attempt to break her calm composure by making her wait. "You are used to moving, Zuri, to serving, to reacting to the needs of others," De-Shik finally said, his voice a low, cold authority. "In this world, power is found in the pause. If you cannot master the silence will master you." Zuri met his gaze, her large, expressive eyes narrowing. "I've spent my life being a shadow so I wouldn't be stepped on, Mr. Kang. I know silence better than you do. I just didn't realize you wanted to turn it into a cage." He stood, leaning over the desk until the scent of sandalwood and danger was all she could breathe. "It is not a cage. It is armor. Your pride makes you loud, even when you aren't speaking. My enemies see that pride as a handle to pull on." He reached out, his thumb brushing the line of her sharp jawbone. The touch was brief, electric, and entirely proprietary. "Ryu thinks you are a weakness. I think you are a weapon that hasn't been sharpened yet." "I am not a weapon," Zuri snapped, her melodic voice gaining a sharp edge. "Not yet," De-Shik murmured, his gaze dropping to her full lips. "But by the time the red banquet arrives, you will be the most dangerous thing in this city." The power struggle was no longer about a debt. It was about the friction between her soul and his obsession. Zuri realized then that De-Shik didn't want a submissive girl. He wanted to see if her fire would burn his house down or light his way. The transition from the diner's grease-stained tiles to the marble floors of the grand Seoul ballroom was a violent shift in reality. Zuri stood before the full-length mirror, barely recognizing the woman staring back. The black waitress dress was a ghost of the past, replaced by a floor-length gown of deep crimson silk that clung to her slim, athletic frame like a second skin. Her deep brown complexion glowed under the vanity lights, and her hair, usually pulled into a humble bun, was now a sleek, sophisticated crown. "You look like a target," Ryu Sangmin grunted from the doorway, his scarred eyebrow twitching as he adjusted his earpiece. His presence was a cold reminder that this wasn't a fairy tale, it was a deployment. "Then I'll be the brightest one in the room," Zuri replied, her melodic voice steady despite the hammer of her heart against her ribs. When De-Shik entered, the air in the room seemed to vanish. He wore a black velvet tuxedo that emphasized his broad shoulders and powerful frame. He stopped behind her, his intense dark eyes meeting hers in the reflection. He didn't offer a compliment, he offered a warning. "Tonight, you are the Iron Architect's obsession," he murmured, his hands resting heavily on her shoulders. "Every eye in this room will be a knife. Stay close to me. Do not speak unless I look at you." The gala was a sea of false smiles and hidden holsters. As they entered, the chatter died a sudden, synchronized death. Zuri felt the weight of 100 stares, some hungry, some hateful, all predatory. She kept her chin high, her heart-shaped face a mask of calm composure that defied the room's silent judgment. The illusion of safety shattered during the second course. A waiter, moving with a jagged energy that reminded Zuri of the thugs in the diner, stumbled near their table. De-Shik's hand was on his weapon before the tray even hit the floor. But the attack wasn't a bullet, it was a coordinated blackout. The ballroom plunged into a terrifying, velvet darkness. In the chaos, Zuri felt a rough hand grab her arm, pulling her away from the scent of sandalwood. She didn't scream. Instead, she used the muscle memory of 1,000 double shifts, the balance, the pivot, the sudden shift of weight. She drove her heel into her captor's foot and slammed her elbow back into a ribcage. The emergency lights flickered on. Red and pulsing. De-Shik was standing over a fallen man, his face a mask of glacial fury, his white shirt already stained with a spray of crimson that wasn't wine. He looked at Zuri, seeing her standing over her own attacker, her breath hitching but her eyes burning with a new, dangerous fire. The red banquet had begun, and the quiet waitress was officially dead. The adrenaline of the ballroom had left a metallic taste in Zuri's mouth, a sharp contrast to the luxury of the armored SUV. Beside her, De-Shik was silent, but it wasn't the cold, calculated silence of the Iron Architect. It was heavy, labored. As the vehicle breached the Onyx Gates, Zuri noticed the way his hand clamped over his side, his knuckles white against the dark fabric of his trousers. Inside the foyer, the mask slipped. De-Shik stumbled, his broad shoulders hitting the marble wall with a dull thud. Ryu was at his side instantly, but De-Shik hissed a command in Korean, waving him off. "I can handle him," Zuri said, her melodic voice cutting through the panic. Ryu hesitated, his eyes scanning her face, before he gave a curt, reluctant nod and stepped back to secure the perimeter. She guided De-Shik to his private study, the room smelling of old paper and expensive whiskey. Once the door clicked shut, he collapsed into his leather chair, his breath hitching. Zuri didn't wait for permission. She reached for the buttons of his black velvet tuxedo, her fingers steady as she peeled back the layers of silk and cotton. The white shirt beneath was soaked through, the deep red bloom of blood spreading across his light tan skin. A grazing wound, shallow but jagged. "You're a waitress, Zuri," De-Shik rasped, his eyes fluttering as he fought the pain. "Not a medic." "I spent 3 years working at a diner next to a trauma center," she countered, her large, expressive eyes focused on the wound. "I've seen worse than this before my lunch break." She found a first aid kit in the desk and began to clean the wound. As she worked, she saw something she hadn't expected: scars. Not just the fresh one, but a map of old violence etched into his skin, reminders of every price he had paid to build his fortress. For the first time, the monster looked human. The cold authority in his eyes had been replaced by a raw, quiet vulnerability. He reached up, his hand trembling slightly as he touched the curve of her heart-shaped face. "Why didn't you run?" he whispered. "In the dark, you could have disappeared." Zuri paused, her dark brown eyes meeting his. "Because you cleared my brother's path, De-Shik, and because for the first time in my life I didn't want to be invisible. I wanted to be seen." In that moment, the obsession shifted. It was no longer just his fixating on her. It was a mutual recognition of the scars they both carried. The Iron Architect was bleeding, and the quiet waitress was the only one holding him together. The fragile peace inside the study was shattered by a single vibration on the desk. De-Shik's phone lit up, displaying a message that turned his gaze back to ice. Zuri felt the warmth of the moment evaporate, replaced by a cold dread that started in the pit of her stomach. The betrayal didn't come from a rival syndicate or a masked assassin. It came from the one person Zuri had sacrificed her freedom to protect: Malik. Ryu Sangmin burst into the room, his jaw tight. "We found the leak. It wasn't the guards. It was the brother. He's been feeding the rival faction our location logs in exchange for a clean slate from his own other debts." Zuri's heart-shaped face went pale, her expressive eyes filling with a mixture of disbelief and agony. "Malik, no, he wouldn't. He knows what they are." "He thinks he's saving you from me," De-Shik said, his voice returning to that low, terrifying authority. He stood up, ignoring the sting of his freshly bandaged wound. The vulnerability she had seen minutes ago was buried under layers of charcoal silk and steel. In his eyes, "I am the monster holding you captive. He sold the key to my house to men who will kill us both just to spite me." The internal conflict Zuri had been suppressing finally boiled over. She had become De-Shik's obsession to save her family, only for her family to use that very obsession as a weapon against him. Her pride, her self-sacrifice, it had all been twisted into a trap. "He doesn't understand," Zuri whispered, her melodic voice trembling. "It doesn't matter what he understands," De-Shik replied, checking the slide of his weapon with a chilling click. "He has compromised the Onyx Gates. They are coming, Zuri. And because of your brother's choice, I can no longer guarantee that I won't have to spill his blood to keep yours in your veins." The stakes had never been higher. If Malik succeeded, De-Shik's empire would fall, and Zuri would be dragged back into the gutter or worse. If De-Shik succeeded, Zuri might lose her brother forever. As the perimeter alarms began to howl, Zuri realized the ultimate betrayal wasn't just Malik's. It was her own heart's realization that she was no longer sure whose side she was truly on. The Onyx Gates didn't just open, they were detonated. The shockwave rattled the windows of the study, a violent reminder that the world of silk and steel was fragile after all. "Ryu, get her to the sub-level," De-Shik commanded, his voice a jagged blade. He didn't look back as he drew his weapon, his broad shoulders squared against the impending storm. "No," Zuri said, her voice cutting through the rising howl of sirens. She stood her ground, her red silk gown fluttering in the draft from the hallway. "Malik is out there. If your men find him first, he's a dead man. If the rivals find him, he's a ghost." "He betrayed us, Zuri," De-Shik roared, the first time his cold authority had ever cracked into raw emotion. "He put a target on your back." "He's a fool, not a soldier," she shot back, her large, expressive eyes blazing with a fire that matched his own. "He thinks he's the hero of a story he doesn't understand. Let me reach him. He'll listen to me." Before De-Shik could argue, the door to the study splintered. The trial by fire had arrived. The next few minutes were a blur of shadows and muzzle flashes. Zuri moved with the frantic, calculated grace of someone who had spent years navigating crowded aisles under pressure. But the stakes were no longer a spilled latte. It was life and death. She slipped away from Ryu in the smoke, using the invisible skills she had perfected as a waitress to move through the service corridors she had mapped out during her weeks of lessons. She found Malik in the garden, cowering behind a marble statue, surrounded by 3 men who didn't look like they were there to save anyone. They held him by the throat, a blade pressed against his bruised skin. "Zuri, run!" Malik screamed, his voice breaking. Zuri stepped into the moonlight. Her heart-shaped face set in a mask of terrifying calm. She didn't have a gun, but she had the one thing the rivals wanted, De-Shik's obsession. "Let him go," she said, her melodic voice now a cold, sharp silk. "You want leverage. I'm the only leverage that matters to Kang De-Shik. Take me and leave the boy, or stay here and wait for the man who is currently dismantling your backup in the foyer." The lead mercenary hesitated, swayed by the sheer audacity in her eyes. It was the gamble of a lifetime. In that moment of hesitation, a single shot rang out from the balcony above. De-Shik stood there, his white shirt stained with fresh blood, his eyes fixed on Zuri with a terrifying mix of fury and relief. Zuri didn't wait. She lunged for Malik, dragging him into the shadows as the garden erupted into a final, bloody symphony. She had made her choice. She would protect her blood, but she would do it using the ruthlessness of the man who owned her heart. The smoke from the garden had cleared, but the scent of gunpowder and rain lingered in the air like a final, fatting ghost of the night. Zuri stood on the balcony of the estate, her crimson gown torn at the hem and stained with the grit of the struggle. She watched the sun begin to bleed over the city skyline, turning the neon lights of the slums into distant, insignificant sparks. Behind her, the house was silent, not the pressurized silence of a cage, but the heavy, settled quiet of a battlefield after the victory. Malik was gone, sent to a secure location far from the city with enough money to disappear, and a warning from Ryu that would keep him looking over his shoulder for a lifetime. Zuri had saved his life, but she had severed the tie. Her self-sacrifice was no longer a burden she carried for her family. It was a debt she had paid in full. A heavy step sounded on the marble behind her. De-Shik approached, his movements stiff from his wounds, his broad shoulders draped in a fresh black suit jacket. He stood beside her, his intense dark eyes following her gaze toward the horizon. "The city looks different from up here," Zuri said, her melodic voice now carrying a weight of cold authority that mirrored his own. "It is a city of shadows," De-Shik replied, his voice a low rumble. "But even shadows need a light to define them. I thought I bought a waitress to distract me. I didn't realize I was bringing home the only person capable of ruling this fortress with me." Zuri turned to him, her heart-shaped face no longer showing a flicker of the girl who once nervously wiped down diner counters. She reached out, her warm brown fingers brushing the sharp line of his jaw. "I'm not going back, De-Shik. Not to the diner, and not to being invisible." "I wouldn't let you if you tried," he murmured, his hand covering hers, his thumb tracing the knuckles of the hand that had fought to save him. The transformation was complete. The obsession had evolved into a partnership of equals. Zuri Bennett was no longer a victim of circumstance or a pawn in a mahogany cloak. She was the silent architect of a new order. As the first true rays of light hit the Onyx Gates, Zuri leaned into the man who represented everything she once feared, realizing that in his world of silk and steel, she hadn't just found a sanctuary, she had found her throne.